Chooses the path of conflict. He stands up against the Campbells. In late 1562 he gathers the clan. They make a murderous attack upon a group of Campbells. That is effectively a declaration of war, and it results in the Central Highlands being plunged into 8 years of bloody conflict.
The war between the MacGregors and the Campbells became an endless cycle of retribution and murder that lasted for generations. But out of the chaos came something rare and something precious. A life-affirming love story that's celebrated by one of the greatest Gaelic poems ever written. These words and music celebrate the love that blossomed between clan chief Gregor MacGregor and a young woman called Marion. Theirs was a doomed affair because Marion's family were Campbells and therefore MacGregor enemies. But Marion's love for Gregor transcended the hatred that existed between the two warring clans.
It's a classic Romeo and Juliet story, isn't it, where people who aren't meant to be together are together and then one of them dies. So I think it has gone on throughout history, and because of that, the power of love kind of is something everybody can identify with.
The lovers eloped and went on the run. Then one morning, as they lay in each other's arms, the Campbells and their black dogs tracked them down. Marion, accompanied by her first son by Gregor and heavily pregnant with their second, was forced to watch as Callian Leah himself beheaded her beloved.
It's very difficult to sing that song and not engage yourself in the whole kind of drama of it. It's actually quite an exhausting song to sing to because of that, but I think you can't fail to get emotionally wrapped up in it.
Marion's grief would become an omen for the future of her two sons. Now each in turn would meet a violent and untimely death for the parts they played at the Battle of Glenfruin, perhaps the most pivotal moment in the history of Clan Gregor. It was here in 1603 that Marion's sons led the MacGregors into battle against another clan, the Cahoons of Luss. Ironically, it was the wily Campbells who prompted Marion's son Alistair to fight. It was a decision he'd ultimately regret. Glenfruin holds a grim fascination for landscape photographer Malcolm MacGregor, the current MacGregor clan chief. I met up with Malcolm at the site of the battle to find out how the Campbell Earl of Argyll played off the MacGregors against the Cahoons to his own advantage.
The Earl of Argyll had encouraged Alistair MacGregor of Glenstray, the chief of Clan Gregor, to go after and attack the Cahoons, which he duly did here in Glenfruin.
It sounds to me as if the Campbell Earls of Argyll were using the MacGregors to pursue their own agenda, is that right?
That's correct. The Cahoons were obstructing Argyll's efforts to become very dominant in this area, particularly with the king.
So what happened?
Well, 300 MacGregors came from the northwest via Loch Long into Glenfruin across the side of Strone Hill, which you can see over there. And basically what happened is they were on the high ground, which gave them an incredible tactical advantage. The Cahoons were coming up the glen from the east, and despite the fact that the MacGregors were only 300 in strength and the Cahoons were between 700 and 800, the MacGregors had such tactical advantage that they were able to destroy the Cahoons in that marsh.
That's amazing, a 2-to-1 advantage the Cahoons had, but the MacGregors still won.
Yes, stumbling around in the marshes up to their knees in water, bog and ice would have meant that the MacGregors would have had a field day in cutting them down.
To our shame, the battle became a massacre. Over 140 Cahoons were killed, including a party of schoolboys who'd come to watch. King James VI was so horrified that he inflicted the greatest punishment possible on the MacGregors. He deprived them of their name by proscribing the clan. From now, simply bearing the MacGregor name was punishable by death. To find out how this affected my own family's ancestors, I met up with another member of the clan, Peter Lorry.
Proscription took many forms. You have to discriminate between those MacGregors who'd perhaps been involved in Glenfruin, for which there was punishment, very often death, and the rest of the clan, who may have been totally innocent of Glenfruin, but were still MacGregors. The women could be prescribed, would be marked on the cheek, branded, to mark them out as being MacGregors and therefore to be despised. Children would be taken from their parents. MacGregors were not allowed to travel in groups of more than 2 or 3. They weren't allowed to carry edged weapons in a time when you had to have an edged weapon in order to cut your meat. But the fundamental issue was they were not allowed to use their name. The name MacGregor was to be utterly forbidden and never heard of again.
So that, I mean, it seems to me that's a kind of a form of genocide, surely.
I think you could call it a form of genocide. The idea was that they had been portrayed to the king as being the most dangerous source of disorder in the Highlands, and therefore they had to be destroyed.
Now, I believe there were incentives given to people to hunt down MacGregors.
Oh yes, up to very large sums of money for the time. Anything up to £1,000 has been mentioned for a MacGregor head. And it was worse than that. It wasn't just trying to persuade some stranger to say, go in like a bounty hunter. It was incentives given to MacGregors to betray other MacGregors.
So what was in it for the Campbells?
They started out in 1550 with less land than the Clan Gregor had. By 1800, they were the biggest landlords in Scotland. That's what was in it for the Campbells. And this is what the whole conflict was about, using the power of the state to misrepresent who the MacGregors were and what the MacGregors had done in order to obtain their possessions.
As the Campbells took over in the 1600s, bounty hunters with a licence to kill came after anyone bearing the name MacGregor. Like my own family, many MacGregors changed their name to survive, while others fled to the hills. About 70 years after the Battle of Glenfruin, Clan Gregor was still living under the shadow of proscription. But then a character emerged whose life and exploits wouldn't just help keep the name alive, they would make it legendary. Rob Roy MacGregor's life reads like a western. Such was his notoriety that he became a legend in his lifetime. The bandit, the outlaw, rebel and lovable rogue. Ironically, Rob Roy had started out with hopes of becoming a gentleman and prospering in business. But proscription meant he couldn't trade using the MacGregor name. So he chose another. And incredibly, it was as a Campbell that Rob Roy grew rich on cattle. Up until the 19th century, cattle were the backbone of the Highland economy. Every autumn, thousands of beasts were driven along ancient drove roads, making their slow progress through the glens to markets in the south. Rob Roy MacGregor was a master of this now vanished tradition. 20 years ago, Arthur John Kay drove a herd of cattle across Scotland, researching a way of life that allowed men like Rob Roy to cash in on the richest business in the Highlands. But with fortunes to be made, cattle rustling became inevitable.
Cattle stealing, cattle rustling, cattle lifting, they called it, was a traditional activity in the Highlands from very, very ancient times. It only really became criminal from about the beginning of the 18th century when the value of cattle shot up. Before that, rustling someone else's cattle was a kind of sport. Everyone engaged in it, and it wasn't thought to be particularly illegitimate. But with the Act of Union and the much greater value attached to cattle because they could be exported to England, then suddenly it became a much more criminal activity.
And Rob Roy MacGregor was involved in the cattle trade.
Yes, Rob Roy is interesting because his dates exactly straddle that period. He was born in 1680, so 27 years before the Act of Union. He was brought up in the clan tradition. He was into rustling, of course. And then suddenly the trade becomes extremely valuable and he becomes, as it were, a bona fide drover. So he knows both sides of the fence, and so do all his associates, his fellow drovers. Many of them were, and would again be, cattle rustlers.
It's probably fair to say that Rob Roy was born to rustle cattle, simply because there were no greater practitioners of the art than his MacGregor kinsfolk. And if this ancient practice were in his blood, then so too was blackmail. Now,